In December of 1847, a package arrived at a London publishing office containing the manuscript for the most violent, polarizing, and strange novel in the English language. Today, we treat Wuthering Heights like a classic. We put it on high school reading lists and turn it into misty-eyed movie romances. But if you were standing in a bookstore in 1847, you wouldn't have seen a masterpiece. You would have seen a high-end luxury asset, priced specifically to keep you from owning it. 31 shillings and sixpence. In Victorian England, that wasn't just a price tag. It was a wall. Look at the math. If you were an average office clerk, that 3-volume set cost you 3 full weeks of your life. If you were a factory worker, you'd have to work for 45 days straight just to buy it. This wasn't an accident. It was a monopoly run by a man named Charles Moody. His select library was essentially the media giant of the 1800s. But with one major difference, he didn't just distribute the content, he dictated it. Moody's entire business model relied on the 3-decker format. One story broken into 3 separate physical books. Why? Because if a book is in 3 parts, 3 different subscribers can be renting it at the same time. It maximized his turnover. This infrastructure actually changed the writing itself. Authors had to pad their stories to fit the length Moody demanded. Every long-winded description, every side plot, every extra chapter of a Victorian novel was often just a requirement of the rental market. But Moody wasn't just a businessman. He was the ultimate censor. He was the gatekeeper of decency. If a book was too honest about how the rich actually made their money, he simply wouldn't stock it. And if Moody didn't stock it, the book vanished. This tells us something crucial before we even read the first page. Wuthering Heights was packaged for the very people it was meant to offend, wealthy subscribers sitting in clean drawing rooms, reading about savagery from the safety of a rented book. To find the truth here, we have to look past the poetry and start looking at the logistics. We have to look at the world that paid for the ink. In Chapter 4 of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, the entire plot is set in motion by a logistical anomaly that defies the standard social patterns of the era. Mr. Earnshaw, the patriarch and owner of the farm, announces to his children that he is walking to Liverpool. While this is often dismissed by modern readers as a simple, perhaps eccentric journey, the logistics of 1771 suggest a much higher degree of risk and a potential cover-up of his true movements. Haworth to Liverpool is 60 miles one way. In the 1770s, this path required navigating the Pennine Mountains, a landscape dominated by treacherous peat bogs, vertical inclines, and a near total absence of paved infrastructure or protection from the elements. Earnshaw claims he will return in just 3 days, implying a 120-mile round trip. This would require 40 miles of walking per day through mountain terrain, while carrying a heavy wool-lined winter greatcoat. To put this in perspective, in the 18th century, 40 miles was considered a full, exhausting day's journey for a healthy horse. For a middle-aged landowner on foot, it is a feat that borders on the physically impossible unless driven by a desperate necessity to remain unseen. This was not a hike, it was a forced march. As a wealthy yeoman landowner, Earnshaw had access to a stable of horses. His choice to walk suggests a specific tactical or legal necessity. Under the Vagrancy Acts of the time, the British government viewed masterless men on foot with profound suspicion. A man of property, travelling without the status markers of a horse or carriage, risked being flagged as a criminal, a runaway, or a man whose credit had collapsed, thereby jeopardizing his entire social and legal standing. By stepping off his horse, Earnshaw was effectively stepping out of his class and into a legal grey zone where he could be arrested as a rogue and a vagabond. The primary advantage of walking was the absence of a paper trail. Travelling by horse necessitated paying for stables and fodder at every inn along the route, where names were frequently recorded in ledgers for tax, security, and local surveillance purposes. Stagecoaches involved a dozen witnesses, drivers, tavern keeps, and fellow passengers, who could accurately track a traveller's movements, baggage, and associates. A man on foot, moving through the mist of the Pennine frontier, was effectively a ghost. He could move through the landscape without leaving a single receipt for his presence. Earnshaw's destination, Liverpool, is equally significant to this dossier. In 1771, Liverpool was the central hub of the transatlantic slave trade, the Silicon Valley of human trafficking. It was a city built on the mechanics of global shipping and the extraction of wealth from the colonies. It was the wealthiest and most violent port in the world, a place where fortunes were made on the margins of the law. When Earnshaw returns and reveals a dark-skinned child who speaks a language no one understands, he is not merely bringing home an orphan, he is bringing home a physical reminder of the brutal origins of England's growing wealth. The family's immediate attempt to frame Heathcliff using the language of folklore, calling him a goblin, a changeling, or a fairy child, functions as a psychological defense mechanism. They utilised 16th century myths to obscure a terrifying 18th century reality. The quiet, secluded English countryside was now inextricably tied to the industrial violence of the colonies. Heathcliff is the outside world finally arriving to claim a seat at the table, a physical embodiment of the invisible labour that funded the British gentry. He is the first dividend of an empire that the characters are too terrified to acknowledge. The most significant data gap in the narrative occurs during Heathcliff's 3-year disappearance. He leaves as a penniless, uneducated labourer who has been treated as little more than livestock, and he returns as a gentleman of terrifying composure, possessing the vocabulary of a scholar and the rigid bearing of a soldier. To identify the source of this unexplained wealth, we must analyse the high-risk, high-reward markets of 1780. One primary avenue for rapid wealth accumulation during this window was the American Revolution. While common infantrymen earned mere pennies, the British military utilised privateers, state-sanctioned pirates. Under the Prize Act, the crew of a private vessel that captured an enemy merchant ship, be it French, Spanish or American, could split the cargo. A single successful capture of a ship carrying indigo, silver or tobacco could transform a runaway into a wealthy man overnight. This was the only ladder that allowed a man to bypass 3 centuries of class hierarchy in just 36 months. It was a legal lottery where the stakes were death and the prize was social reinvention. Alternatively, Heathcliff's trajectory mirrors that of the East India Company nabobs. This was the era of corporate raiders who extracted wealth in India through a combination of military force, extortion, and aggressive tax collection. These men returned to England to buy their way into the high aristocracy, though they were often loathed by old money families who saw their capital as new, dirty, and foreign. They proved that you didn't need a 1,000-year-old family name to rule the moors. You just needed to be the most ruthless man in the room. Regardless of the specific origin, Heathcliff returned having mastered the most important lesson of the 18th century. Violence and extraction are the most efficient ways to build a balance sheet. He did not return to find love, he returned to implement a corporate takeover of the valley. He brought back a mindset that treated social history and family legacies as assets that could be purchased, leveraged, and ultimately rewritten. His return was not a reunion, it was the beginning of an audit of the Earnshaw and Linton lineages. Upon his return, Heathcliff shifts his strategy from physical struggle to legal warfare. He views the surrounding estates not as homes or ancestral seats, but as assets on a spreadsheet to be liquidated. His acquisition of Wuthering Heights is executed through a sophisticated debt trap that exploits the fundamental flaws in the era's financial laws regarding land ownership and credit. He exploits Hindley Earnshaw's gambling addiction by positioning himself as the primary lender. In the 1780s, an estate could not typically be lost in a single hand of cards, due to the complexities of land law. However, the equity could be systematically drained through a series of high-interest loans and mortgages. Heathcliff provides the capital to keep the games going, securing every dollar against the land itself. When Hindley dies, the accumulated debt exceeds the market value of the estate. Heathcliff does not usurp the property in a traditional sense. He executes a lien and claims his collateral. He is the debt collector walking in to claim the prize, using the laws of contract to override the ancient laws of family succession. His strategy regarding the Linton family at Thrushcross Grange is even more predatory, utilising 2 specific legal structures: primogeniture and coverture. Primogeniture was the law of the land, ensuring that the oldest son inherited the entirety of an estate to keep the land whole. This left daughters like Catherine with 0 legal standing once their fathers died. Catherine's marriage to Edgar Linton was not merely a choice of vibes or passion, it was an act of economic survival. Without a husband with property, she would have faced literal vagrancy or domestic servitude. She was trading her identity for a roof and a legal protector. Heathcliff counters this by utilising coverture. This legal doctrine stated that upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was erased and covered by her husband. She owned nothing, not her clothes, not her dowry, and certainly not her future inheritance. By kidnapping Isabella Linton and forcing her into marriage, Heathcliff legally seized her entire future interest in the Linton estate. He then engineered a forced marriage between his sickly son and the younger Catherine to trap the final remnants of the family fortune into a single legal entity he controlled. He optimized the very tools designed by the aristocracy to keep outsiders out, using them to dismantle the families from the inside. Furthermore, he changed the business model of the moors. While the Lintons maintained Thrushcross Grange as a cost centre, a park designed for leisure, landscaping and aesthetics, Heathcliff utilised the process of enclosure. He fenced off the common lands that the poor had used for centuries for grazing and fuel, turning social land into private profit. This move essentially privatised nature, turning the moors into a profit machine. He maximised sheep farming. winched every cent out of the soil, and treated the moors as a factory floor. He won because he was a better capitalist than the people who were born to own the land. He understood that in the new century, land was not a heritage. It was a commodity to be exploited until dry. While Heathcliff was managing the spreadsheets, the characters were being drained by a medical system that functioned as a wealth-stripping machine. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, medical care was not just primitive, it was an economic drain that favoured the survivor and bankrupted the sick. The Victorian doctor was often the final agent in an estate's liquidation, his fees acting as a post-mortem tax. Based on humoral theory, doctors of the era believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If a character like Catherine was agitated or feverish, the physician wouldn't prescribe rest, he would prescribe bloodletting. They would physically drain the capital out of her body, believing that removing vitiated blood would restore balance. They used leeches and lancets to remove excess blood, which, ironically, weakened the patient's immune system just enough for the tuberculosis prevalent in the local environment to take root. This was not healthcare, it was a slow, expensive form of physical and financial attrition. The cost of this care was astronomical, and often undisclosed until the final bill arrived. In 1801, a single visit from a distinguished physician could cost 5 guineas, roughly equivalent to $800 in modern purchasing power. For the Lintons at the Grange, this was an expensive line item that required liquidating portions of their savings. For the Earnshaws, whose wealth was tied up in land and livestock, it was a direct threat to their capital stability. The doctor's fees were often the first claim against an estate, paid out before any heirs could see a cent, ensuring that even in death, the gentry was being billed for its own decline. Furthermore, the Gothic funeral economy of the 1840s required a staggering investment in social status to maintain the appearance of respectability. A proper, middle-class funeral required professional mutes, mourners who stood silently at the door, ostrich plumes, elaborate silk dressings, and carved mahogany coffins. A single funeral could cost £50, nearly half a year's wages for a working man. As the primary creditor and executor of these estates, Heathcliff was not just burying his enemies, he was watching the liquid assets of his rivals literally vanish into the ground. Every death facilitated a massive wealth transfer back to him as the last man standing, as he likely charged interest on the very funds the family borrowed to buy the coffins. He was profiting from the very dirt he would eventually own. Finally, we must address the biological reality that underpinned the entire narrative and provided the supernatural atmosphere of the book. In 1850, a sanitary inspector named George Smith was sent to investigate the conditions in Haworth. His report is a document of pure, unadulterated horror that strips the Gothic romance away from the setting and replaces it with a crisis of public health. Haworth had no sewers. The town graveyard was located at the highest point of the hill, while the primary town well was at the bottom. The ground was composed of porous sandstone, which acted as an inadvertent conduit for pathogens. George Smith's report was chillingly clinical. The graveyard functioned as a giant biological filter. Every time it rained, the water filtered through the decomposing remains of the previous generation and flowed directly into the drinking supply of the people below. The haunting of the moors was not a supernatural event. It was a localized epidemic of cholera and tuberculosis, a cycle of infection that kept the population in a state of constant physical and mental decline. The characters weren't seeing ghosts, they were suffering from waterborne pathogens. In an environment where the average life expectancy was just 25 years, death was not a mood, it was the baseline reality. Medical journals of the time noted a specific symptom of tuberculosis called spes, PHTICICA, a manic euphoric energy that often occurred just before death. It created a restless, obsessive drive to settle affairs, marry off children, and finish business. A final flare-up of the nervous system as the body consumed itself. The famous intensity of the characters, the screaming on the mountains, the manic, circular conversations, and the frantic movement, is a clinical reflection of the adrenaline of the dying. They were racing against a biological clock that was ticking twice as fast as the rest of the world. They were a community drinking their own mortality, fighting to own something, to name something, or to dominate someone before the environment reclaimed them. Their passion was actually the frantic energy of a fever dream, fueled by the very water that was killing them. They lived at a pace dictated by their own impending extinction. Wuthering Heights serves as a forensic record of a specific moment in 1847. It captures the liquidation of the old world of bloodlines and honor by the cold, calculating forces of industrial capital and environmental reality. It is a dossier of the receipts accumulated over a century of legal theft, systemic exploitation, and biological collapse. The characters are not fighting for love, They are fighting for a seat at a table that has already been cleared by the bailiff and the undertaker. This is a story about the cost of holding on to the past when the present has already been sold. And the debt? It looks like it has finally been paid in full, with interest, in a currency that no one in the book can afford to spend.